I think we're recording. It's September 30th, 2000.
No, January.
January 30th. Thank you.
You want to start again? You want to start
No,
over?
I don't. It's January 30th, 2016. I'm here with Ruth Libby, my mom, and we're just doing a little bit of an oral history. And I thought I would start by letting you tell me a little bit about the early Robinson history, you know, how they got to Evansville, just a little bit about the background, where they were from, and on your mom and dad's side.
And I'll try not to take too long.
That's fine. Take as much time as you want.
Isaiah Robinson was a Methodist minister, was living in Irisburg, Vermont, and moved west.
Time period.
Well, you know, Neil, you might have to help me because Theodore was born in Evansville in 1852, so sometime prior to that.
And this is Isaiah?
Yes, Neil? He's not here. What's
your interview, Pi?
No, tell me what Theodore's dad's name was.
Elijah.
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 I knew it wasn't
Okay.
right. I'm sorry,
Elijah.
Elijah. And I think he actually stopped in a couple of towns in Ohio or Illinois before he got to Wisconsin. But moved to Evansville. Was a Methodist minister. I think he retired from the minister and had a store. They owned a house on West Main Street in Evansville, which we could point out. He had Hamlin, Theodore, and J.C. My grandfather was J.C. He was the oldest. And I don't know much about him in high school and things, but I think he went to the Evansville Seminary. I'm not even sure if they had a public high school at that time in Evansville.
Okay, the farm that you grew up on, was that J.C.'s farm, or was that his father's farm?
That was J.C.'s farm.
Okay.
And he...
Before they had J.C.'s farm, did they have another farm?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
He was the first farmer. And he bought that land when he was 19. Which was unusual, and I'm not sure if it was a loan or if there was some family money, but he started that farm, and it was a 200-acre farm with good farmland, and that was a lot of land at that time. Most of the farm homesteads around us had originally been 80 acres, and so it was a good-sized farm. It was all very fertile, and he started raising Hereford cattle, purebred Hereford cattle. A lot of people in Wisconsin had milking cows, dairy cattle, but he had the Hereford, a purebred herd, which he built up, and they raised Southdown sheep, purebred Southdown sheep also.
So J.C. was Elijah's son, and there were... J.C. had two brothers?
Yes, Theodore Robinson, the painter.
Okay.
And Hamlin, who was also well educated and was a newspaper reporter and then a newspaper editor, and I think moved to Marysville, Missouri with his family.
Without
Yeah.
You could spend a lot of time talking about Theodore, but just tell us briefly about J.C.'s brothers, Theodore, and what was the other brother's name?
Hamlin.
Hamlin.
Theodore always had asthma, and they knew he could not, do hard physical work. He loved to draw, drew as a child and as a young adult. I think he went into Chicago and studied at the Art Institute. He spent a year in Denver because I think they thought it might help his asthma, the clear mountain air, and took art lessons there. I've always thought the family was a little progressive in that they encouraged the art as a profession, which I think was unusual at the time. And he traveled a lot as a young man. Hamlin, I don't know as much about his young adulthood, but I know he moved to Missouri, married, had a couple of daughters.
What did J.C. do if he wasn't a farmer?
He was the farmer.
He was a farmer, okay.
Yes, and he bought the land, and
I'm not JC, I'm sorry, Elijah. I asked.
he was the Methodist minister.
Okay.
And then I believe had a general store in sometime in his working career also. And you know, the story is, and I guess it is a true story, when he was preaching, Theodore was supposed to be pumping the organ. And he always drew in the hymn books instead of listening to his father. So supposedly there were pictures that he drew as a kid in the hymn books. That's how he entertained himself.
Okay. And then tell me a little bit more about JC. You said that he was raising Herefords instead of dairy cows. And tell me a little bit about...
Okay, JC married a woman in the Evansville area, Mary. They had Hugh, who was my grandfather, first, and then a daughter, Madge, and then a daughter, Olive. And the Hereford business was interesting because there weren't Herefords, a lot of Herefords in Wisconsin. So JC and later Hugh traveled throughout the West buying bulls for their herd or buying heifers for the herd. And it was a show herd. So another thing that they did, they had strings of show cattle. And when I was small, it was kind of the end of an era. But they would put these cattle, show cattle, in boxcars and take them to Chicago and show them, or to Denver. Or one of the big shows was the American Royal in Kansas City. And we have that picture of my Uncle Phil that was on the cover of the Hereford Journal, and he was brushing out one of the bulls for show day.
Okay.
And they'd show and sell. So the idea was to take these cattle, show them, have them do well, and then there would be an auction and you'd sell the cattle.
So Hugh would be your grandfather and JC would be your great-grandfather?
Yes, correct.
Okay. And then Hugh had Grandpa Rusty, or Harold Robinson, and then Phil Robinson.
And then, yes, and he married Mabel Barnard Robinson.
Hugh
married Mabel.
Okay.
And they lived in the big house. And I lost my train of thought I was going to say. But anyway, Mabel was from the east side of Evansville. They had a daughter, Ruth Mary, who was born in about 1912. She, my grandmother always said, was healthy. Something happened when she was 2. She became very sick and almost died. And after that, her heart was never strong. And later, my grandmother wondered if she'd had strep throat. And you know, that can go and cause heart damage with no antibiotics and stuff. But they never knew that.
Was she the relative that rode the pony back and forth to school?
Yes, she was my dad's older sister. She did take the pony, Skippy, who I remembered, and rode the pony to school. She was the oldest, and I think there were 4 years between Ruth and Phil, and then 4 years later, my dad.
So Ruth, Harold, and Phil.
Ruth, Phil, and Harold.
Ruth, Phil, and Harold.
Yes,
okay.
My dad was the youngest.
Okay.
Then on my mother's side of the family, both of my grandparents, Martin Anderson and his wife Anna, and now I cannot remember one of them. No, I remember. Martin was born in Norway. And the story was that when the family came over on the ship, his sisters would worry to death because he would run up and jump on the rails and run around the boat, of course, because he was probably a bored kid. And I can remember my 2 great aunts telling about how they used to worry about him on the ship. They came into New York and I think pretty directly moved to Wisconsin because there were a lot of Scandinavians. I think it was a common destination. And
cool climate. And
similar to Norway. Lived in the Stoughton vicinity. My grandmother Anderson was born in the States. She had a very large family. I think there were 9 children. And my sisters and I remember this differently, and I would like to do the research. I remember that she was the oldest, Stuckey. Her family name was Stuckey. Her mother died and her dad remarried. But my sisters don't remember that story at all. But anyway, there were 9 children. They were so poor that we never heard any stories about their childhood. And my grandmother never talked about it. I had 2 great aunts, Aunt Clara and Aunt Alida, who lived in Stoughton and Edgerton. And they would say, oh, you don't want to hear. My mother and my Aunt Dorothy would ask them about their childhood. And they would say, you don't want to hear about it. We were so poor. My grandfather, Anderson, also, I think, was poor, but I don't think it affected him as much. Although he lived in the town of Stoughton. He had 2 sisters, Inga and Anna, and a younger brother, whose name I forget now, I'll remember it. But his dad worked on a ship on the Great Lakes. And the family story is that they made him, of course, was
He was a migrant, basically.
Yes, and had no rights, no education. My Aunt Dorothy told the story that they made him paint the ship when it was moving, and he fell off painting the ship. And I think was buried at sea, although there was, maybe not, because she traveled to Cleveland and they found some evidence that he had lived and died there outside of Cleveland. So Martin what I remember is that he went to work at 9 years of age to support the 2 younger sisters.
9.
9, and the younger brother. And he sold newspapers, and at some fairly early age, tobacco was a big crop, and I think they were tobacco factories. But, they bring the tobacco in and they process it. And he started work and worked at a young age. There is, though, a family picture of him in a football uniform. He was very athletic. And supposedly, he never went to high school, but he played for the Stoughton High School football team. Or he went to high school long enough to play on the team or something. Maybe he didn't work year-round, but he did play football because we have a picture of him. So,
Then you haven't really told me about your mom.
All right. My grandfather, Martin, and Anna, she grew up in Stoughton. He was quite a successful businessman. He started a clothing store back in the days when they had, real clothing stores, and sold men's clothing. He got a job, the family story is, for some government agency during the Depression when times were tough, and he worked there until they found out he was Republican, and they fired him.
Oh.
That's a family story. He lost the store, though, during the Depression.
Okay.
There were people, though, at his funeral who told stories about if he had, like Dorothy and Bud both went on to college, and he thought college was important, and lots of people came, and if they didn't have enough money during the Depression to get back to college, he gave them money. Or he was known for giving winter coats to boys who needed coats in the wintertime. So he was, I don't know, a philanthropist of sorts. But after the Depression, he opened up a clothing store in Evansville. And I actually think my dad met my mother because they were both athletic, and my dad knew my Uncle Bud when they were living in Stoughton because they played baseball together. And my dad and my uncle Bud were very good friends and were good friends throughout their life. My dad did tell the story that Uncle Bud had this pesky little sister that he didn't think much of because she was 4 years younger. And then all of a sudden she kind of grew up and he noticed her, and that's my mother.
That's the end of the story.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so then how did they end up on the farm together? And was your dad working for his dad on the farm essentially?
You
or?
know, there is some of that is lost in time. But both Uncle Phil and my dad went out west to work on Hereford ranches. And Ding could tell you better than I, but she knows some of the ranches that they both worked on. Colorado, Montana, and Arizona. And I think working for your dad is not easy. And as I think JC died in 1936. So at some point during the 30s, both Phil and Dad were away. But I think when JC died, one and then the other came back to work on the farm.
Did JC die of a heart attack or an illness, or do we know?
I don't know.
So then Grandpa and Phil come back, and then how did that work out for the two of them working on the farm together?
Well, and Phil, I think, enlisted in World War II. He was not married at the time. Dad was 4 years younger, so he enlisted early. He wanted to go overseas, and he told this story. But because he was a farmer, he knew meat, he was a meat inspector. They had to feed all these troops, and I think he spent World War II in St. Louis.
Why train a meat inspector when you have one who knows how to do it?
Right. And he met a woman and married while he was in the service, but it did not work out. And when he came back to Evansville...
I never knew that Uncle Phil was married.
Yes. And I think he never got over it. And the story, and this may not be entirely fair, but she did not want to be a farmer's wife. And when she found out he was going to go back to the farm, that was it. And I don't think gold digger is the correct term, but she wanted something more than that. And then my dad, the World War II did play a big part. When my dad and mother married, it was 1940, or they married in December 1939, but there was a lot of war talk. And one of the things my dad always wanted to do was join the army. But Phil was in the army, and I think there was a law about a surviving brother. And in any event, his parents were just deathly against him joining up also and leaving the farm and leaving Hugh alone on the farm. So he never joined up.
And the country needed the farmers to be productive.
That's true. Farming, they did need the farmers.
Okay, so...
So we have my parents married, perhaps.
And they're married and they're on the farm. And tell me a little bit about your growing up on the farm and what that was like and what it was like. Because it was a pretty big operation, as I recall, there being farm hands and family meals and that type of thing.
Yes, we always had a hired man. Before the war, they always had they called them hired girls. They always had somebody in the big house. They had at least one hired hand and one hired girl because they cooked for groups, and there was a lot of work on the farm. And it was a fairly big operation because they had the two big barns. They built a machine shop in which they fixed a lot of the machinery. I remember Dad went to welding school, so he could when they sort of left the horses behind and had tractors, there was more and more stuff that needed to be fixed.
And you fixed it yourself back
Yes,
then.
and they had a place for lambs, and they had a place for chickens, and they had places to put the equipment, the farm machinery in the wintertime. So it was pretty big. I don't remember a lot. I remember living in the small house. I was
And the
glad.
small house was 3 bedrooms, right? Or 4?
Well, no.
It was small.
2 bedrooms upstairs, 1 bedroom down.
It was small compared to the big house, but it wasn't small.
It was probably an average house
Right.
for the 40s and early 50s.
Okay.
And I'm glad I had the sisters because we played a lot together because there wasn't anybody else close when we were little that we could play with.
And I know, but we haven't talked about it.
Yes.
Your sisters were
Yes,
who and when were they?
I was born in May of 1940. Catherine was born in August of 1942, and Barbara was born in November of 1943. And I, of course, don't remember Catherine being born, but I can vividly remember my mother bringing Barbara home from the hospital, and she had red hair. But I remember she had red hair even then, and I wanted a brother. I had a sister, and that was fine.
You were disappointed.
But I was a little disappointed. I can remember we spent a lot of time at our grandmother's house. I can remember that. And I can remember playing out in the yard on the east side of the big house. And one of the things I can remember is my grandpa, Hugh, putting me on Ruth's pony because they still had, I'm almost sure it was the same pony, still alive, giving me rides on Skippy. And I can remember playing out in the barnyard and being chased by geese and Grandpa Hugh coming to rescue me. But I don't remember a whole lot. You asked about World War II, and one of the interesting stories is I can remember my dad and mother following all the battles of World War II because there were a lot of people from Evansville in the Pacific, and they followed the units so they knew where people were. And I can remember them having maps and looking for, all the little islands in the Pacific that they probably had never heard of before.
And Grandpa's friend, Bill Schuster.
Yes, was the prisoner of war. He'd been in the Philippines and was a Japanese prisoner of war for several years. And both of my parents were very affected by friends of theirs who were killed. My mother's favorite cousin, David Seamanson, was a navigator on a plane. It held bombs, I think, and it blew up or was shot down over Burma. And several of my dad's friends were killed, mainly in the Pacific.
And then when you were a little girl on the farm, did you ever have chores? Did you help out on the farm, or were you separate from that?
There weren't any boys. So Catherine and I, more than Barb, spent, and this, she may have a different recollection, but the farm was good because we saw a lot of our dad. Much more than if he had gone off and worked, 40 hours or 50 hours a week in a factory. He was around all the time, and we loved to be outside and spend time with him. I don't know. There were some things we couldn't do and they wouldn't let us do, like ride on the machinery with him. But we spent time outside. One of my memories is Catherine was always small, and she would put her hand in my dad's back jean pocket so he couldn't walk too fast. So she could keep up with him when we were outside with him. And she loved being outside and helping outside even more than I did. But we'd feed the cattle.
And did you have chickens and geese and things like that?
Yes, and it is so funny. Barb and Ding remember the chickens fondly. I hated those chickens. we'd have to pick up eggs, and then we had a chicken house, and there were chicken, where they had the nests and were laying their eggs, and you'd have to reach in and pick up the egg. And those damn chickens would peck at you. And why we didn't put on a glove, I don't know. And I always thought the chicken house smelled. And the chickens were mean. I've got that ranting about chickens. The chickens were mean. They'd pick out one poor hen and peck at her. There and every batch, it seemed like there was on one. There would be one. And then we'd get pullets in the spring and get a new batch of, because I think the laying hens would just lay one year, and that was it. They'd get these, and they were so cute when they were little. And they'd have all these pullets, and they'd have lights to keep them warm. And
a pullet's a baby chicken?
Yeah, the baby chickens. But they were so stupid. If something scared them, you had to be really quiet and really careful, because if you scared them, they'd all go in a corner and smother each other. And you didn't want to be responsible for the death of the poor cute little pullets. But anyway, we did. We had to feed the chickens, make sure they had water.
And the geese, weren't the geese mean back then too?
They chased me, yes. I remember the geese as being mean, and for a lot of holiday meals we had goose. Goose was kind of the fowl of choice for Thanksgiving and Christmas. Maybe not Thanksgiving, but at least Christmas. And we always had calves in the barn, which had to be fed. I don't remember doing much with the sheep, although, Grandma Mabel, she was a saint. I can remember bringing Grandpa, my dad, and Phil, bringing in baby lambs if it turned cold, and thawing them out or putting them in hot water in the house to revive them, because sheep are not very hardy. You had to watch them very carefully. My Uncle Phil, I don't know if your father said this, but my Uncle Phil always said, a sheep is born waiting to find some place to die.
And it sounds like you were never short of food. It seems like all the food would have been just fresh and organic and just...
Yes, and times were tight, and people, like I can remember Mother Libby talking about food rationing and only being able to get so much meat, and I don't know what else was rationed, but gas was rationed, but we always had enough, there was always enough food to eat. And a lot of people say they were poor, but they didn't know it. And I think part of that is because everybody was in the same economic circumstances at that time.
And school, did you tell me about school, the school that you and
I was lucky. My mother and dad sent me to kindergarten in town.
Okay.
And I swear I can remember your dad. And I can remember, I don't know. I can remember several people in kindergarten. But then I went to Pleasant Prairie School, which was a one-room school with one teacher, and probably between 22 and 32 or 34 kids, depending on mainly the tenant farmers who was living in some of the rental houses.
Now, first through 12th?
First through eighth grade. And everybody went into Evansville to high school. Because even when I was little, I think that you had to go to school until you were 16.
And so in the one-room schoolhouse, was there one teacher?
Yes, there was one teacher. Another story is the teacher in my first 2 years, I probably shouldn't say, was Mrs. Moldenhauer. And my mother, I didn't hear this until I was older, but at the end of first grade, everybody thought I was reading so well. And my mother noticed when I was reading these books that I wasn't looking at the words. I had memorized everything. And she said I could barely read.
And how old were you?
That was the end of first grade.
Okay.
And it was Miss Moldenhauer, they decided, was not a very effective teacher. But I think she'd already signed the contract for next year. So she taught my first and second year. And then in third grade, I got a firm but really very good teacher, Doris Roberts, and she was there till I was in 8th grade. And she was the only reason I got the education that I did, because she was
A good teacher.
she was a good teacher, thank goodness.
Plumbing? No plumbing in the schoolhouse?
We had outdoor restrooms, one for the girls and one for the boys.
An outhouse.
An outhouse.
Did you bring your lunch in a pail, or did you go home
We
for
had
lunch?
well, that's sort of interesting. We brought, I had a lunch pail. I think at times I walked home for lunch, because in that day, the big meal was at lunch. It was dinner. Dinner was at noon. But later I can remember bringing a lunch, and there was no running water in the school. Well, there was a pump, an old-fashioned pump with a handle, so there was water.
Was it cold in the winter?
Yes, it was cold.
Did
The
they have a
outdoor
fireplace,
bathroom-
or was it
No, it was heated.
It was heated,
The
okay,
water
like a
wasn't
furnace.
heated, though. There was a furnace, yes. And it wasn't a coal stove. There was some kind of central heat, so it was warm. But there were no reading books. And every month from the county, there would be a traveling box of books for the whole school, from, primary books up through 8th grade. And I can remember going through all of those books and reading them, because there wasn't any library.
And I should have asked Dad this, but I didn't. But did you all have televisions and telephones growing up, or?
Oh, that's another sad thing about my father's life. It's not sad, but it's funny, and he never forgot it. When I was growing up, there was the old wooden wall phone. And on our line, I think our number was 547. There were
Three digits?
3 digits.
You had a three-digit phone
we were
number?
R4. There were 8 people on our line. And we got 4 rings when it was, when the phone call was for us. But you'd hear, every time somebody else got a call, you'd hear 1, 2, 3, or 4
We were 3.
rings.
Dad said he was 3.
And there was J 1, 2, 3, and 4, and we couldn't hear their rings, but they were on our line. Well, you could never have. When you and I were dating, people could pick up and listen.
So if somebody called somebody else on the line, you could pick up the phone and hear them talking?
Yeah, you could hear them talking whenever anybody else had a call.
Okay.
So it was really, I told Maggie, it was quite a primitive system. But that box, when they finally got the black dial, rotary dial telephones, he wanted to keep that old phone as a memento, but he could not. They had to be turned into Wisconsin Bell.
And television? Did you have television growing up?
We listened to you're bringing back things. We listened to the radio a lot. And there were comedies, and there were serials, and there were situation dramas that we all sat around and listened to the radio. Oh, I should have thought about this before. One was The Shadow. Anyway, there were tons of radio programs, and that was the entertainment.
And would the
in
family
evening.
sit around?
Yeah, oftentimes it would be everybody listening to the radio. I can remember
Who
FDR.
knows?
The Shadow knows. And FDR speaking, it was a really big thing when the president spoke. We got television in 1952 because of the presidential election.
And you would have been 12 then.
And I was 12. And my dad wanted us to see the conventions on TV. And I think they probably still were real conventions then. Before, to see television, Dad had a friend, Jim Johnson, who had a bar in the country about 3 miles from the house. And Annette was a friend of my mother's. We would go down to the bar occasionally.
For TV.
For TV, just, so we could see
A sporting event or a
a
fight or
baseball
something.
game or something, yeah. And life changed with television. Although we could get 3, maybe 4 stations, and you had an antenna on top of the house, and you had to turn it.
Depending on which channel you wanted.
Right, exactly.
And then you got through 8th grade, and then you went off to high school in town?
Yes.
And tell me about high school. Did you play sports
Well,
or activities?
They had no sports for girls. We had the Girls Athletic Association, which they had once a week, and you would have, you'd play soccer or softball or field hockey or something, but it was only, as I recall, it was only once a week. My mother said they had more sports for girls when she was in high school in the 30s than we did for me. Or, all of us.
Right.
I think the transition from country school to city school was easier for me because I'd always gone to church in town, and I had a circle of Lutheran friends who I knew in high school. Although I'd been in Brownie Scouts and Girl Scouts, so I had had some activities in town. High school is always a hard time, I think.
It always has been.
Right, that's just
It's just a tough time.
It is a tough time, but I can remember knowing people, having friends, liking most of the teachers, having a good time in school.
And you mentioned church. Were you active, and were the Robinsons active in the Lutheran church? And tell me about that.
Okay, well, church in that era, I think, was important for a lot of people, at least in small towns in the Midwest. Everybody went to church. If you didn't go to church, it was very unusual. And denominations were stronger. So they didn't have non-denominational churches. Everybody was a Baptist or a Methodist or a Lutheran or a Catholic. And those were the main religions that I grew up with. And my Aunt Dorothy told a story when she was older, and I don't know, she was with a group of people, and she laughed and she said, now, I knew that people other than Lutherans would get to heaven, but I always thought the Lutherans would be first in line. So people were kind of partial, or devoted to whatever denomination they were. And when I was growing up, it was a big thing if a Lutheran, married a Catholic.
And did Grandpa Rusty and Grandma Mary Jane both happen to be Lutheran, or not?
Grandpa Rusty was a Methodist,
okay,
as the Robinsons, because of the Methodist minister. My grandmother Robinson was brought up a Baptist, but she went to the Methodist church. And I think the Robinsons were not quite as good churchgoers as the Andersons.
Okay.
were. But church was important. Sunday school was important. Confirmation was a big thing. When you were in 7th and 8th grades, you went to confirmation classes. We had to memorize Luther's Small Catechism and recite it. I was about the first in my class, and our good friend Carl Romsted's dad was Reverend Romsted, the Lutheran minister. He was old and strict, but a very good person. To be confirmed before our class, the class would have to sit up in the front of church some Sunday before confirmation, and they would be asked to recite part of Luther's Small Catechism, which was torture, especially for some people. If you memorized easily, it was no big thing. So I was the first class that didn't have to do that. But
work.
You went to confirmation, you memorized, and in 8th grade you were confirmed.
And then when you were growing up, I didn't ask, you were on the farm, but did you participate in the fairs and raise animals and show animals?
Yes, and 4-H was another big part of growing up. You could join 4-H when you were 10. And I think all 3 of us did, and we loved it, and we liked showing cattle.
What animals did you raise, and did you have any winners?
Yes, well, we always showed Hereford steers, and I showed pigs for a couple of years, but by that time they weren't raising pigs, and it was kind of a hassle because we didn't have a pig, a lot of pigs to house, a place to house them. And then we showed the young heifers in the breeding classes. I had the grand champion steer at Rock County one
What does that
year.
mean to have the grand champion steer?
Well, there were three main breeds, Herefords, Shorthorns, and Angus, and each breed would have a champion. So there was a champion, Shorthorn, Hereford, and Angus, and then they'd have a grand champion.
And was that for the local county fair?
That was the Rock County Fair in Janesville. It was, I don't know. There were a lot of animals then. I don't know if there were a couple hundred steers at the time.
And did Uncle Phil help you with the steers? I was just wondering since he had that experience.
Right, yes. And both of them were very good with cattle. I mean, there were, you fed them, you made sure they had water, you walked them, you had to make sure they were tame, you'd put a halter on them and get a show stick, and they needed exercise, you'd walk them every day. You'd have to trim their feet. And before the fair, you would wash them, trim their coats. I mean, there was a whole grooming sequence that you did.
Okay.
And there was another group. I mean, there were a lot of country kids that we knew year after year who were doing the same thing, so it was fun. And we took sewing, we took cooking, we took home grounds improvement when you'd, work around your little farmhouse.
All 4-H, that was a big part of your
It was a big
activity.
part of growing up, and all three of us were active in 4-H. And people volunteered a lot of time, all the leaders. It was pretty intensive. You had to have leaders for the projects and sewing sessions and cooking sessions and so on.
And before we move on to college, do you have any stories that you want to tell about Aunt Barb or Aunt Ding? Any childhood memories of them?
I hadn't thought about that. There certainly are a lot. And poor Catherine was always such a good person. And if something happened, she would be honest and tell. And Barb and I were more willing to stretch the truth a little bit. And Barb was always the comedian, the funny one in the family, and kept everybody laughing. There were tons of stories, but I'd have to think.
That's right. We can
So
always
maybe
come back.
maybe I'll think about it.
We can come back and
We really were a happy family. Although farming is hard because you never knew how much you were going to get for the crops. It isn't like you had a salary and knew you were going to get $100 a week. There was always some question: are the cattle going to sell? How much are they going to sell for?
what are the prices of grain going to be, etc.
Right, exactly. How much is the fertilizer going to cost? It was a happy time, and my dad and uncle went into, in addition to the purebred Herefords, they moved into having feedlot cattle, buying calves and then feeding them out and selling them. They did the same with sheep. They'd buy, I don't know, they called them a pen. I don't even know how many, maybe 20 sheep, feed them, and then sell them on the market. But when I sort of knew this was happening, but we did not talk about it much. When I was 12, the brothers had a dispersion sale, and they sold the Hereford breeding cattle. And it was because the Hereford business, as the Angus and Shorthorn business, it wasn't what it was, and I think it was partly artificial breeding came in. So farmers didn't have to buy bulls.
Okay.
They could, everything would be available commercially. And I think it was actually very traumatic for my dad and Phil, and I think they felt bad. But it was an economic condition, and nobody ever talked about it. I don't remember.
When you say are you saying they sold off the Herefords?
They sold off. That's what the dispersion sale was. They had a big sale at our farm.
And then they became basically farmers of crops and not raisers of cattle?
And they had the feeder cattle.
Okay.
They raised the steers from the young calves and sold them.
For beef, okay.
And I
But
can
instead
remember-
of raising basically Herefords for breeding or to sell bulls,
Yes.
they
sell
probably
the
would
cotton.
raise the bull because
They could steer
farmers
them.
would need bulls.
Right, you always need, yes. But they steered them and sold them for meat.
Okay.
The sale was a big event. I think I have a sale catalog with everything. They were all purebreds. The names were all in, any prizes that they'd won, etc. They had a commercial firm come in, tents. They had a huge lunch where they fed people. And it's interesting because we never talked about it, but I'm sure they both felt horrible that this tradition was ending.
Right.
But it was never talked about. And I wasn't traumatized by it.
You didn't
because
understand.
I didn't understand really what was happening until later.
And then did you all have any family trips that you did growing up? Any?
And that, that's another thing that I was going to mention. I don't know if it was because he went west, but my dad and mother always loved to travel. And we did more than many families did. They took us places. We always went up north we tried to go up for a week every summer. And my parents would fish and we'd hike in the
And up north is
woods.
northern Wisconsin?
Northern Wisconsin. Get a housekeeping cabin on a lake that would have, you could swim off the pier, and they'd have boats that you could take out fishing. We always had a vacation. When I was 10, we took our first long trip, the family, and went to New Orleans.
That would be a big trip from Wisconsin.
And the next year we went to Florida.
And did you see the beaches in Florida?
Yes, we went to St. Augustine and Fort Lauderdale on the east side, and then we went over to the Gulf and stayed on an island in a cabin.
That has to have an impression on a kid from
Yes,
Wisconsin.
I can't tell you, seeing the South was an eye-opener. We had no idea that people lived in sharecropping cabins.
In the 1950s, basically.
Yes, 1950 and probably 1951. Well, and there were no interstates, and there were no motels. You stayed at, they called them travel courts, or people were still letting rooms in their housing, but finding a room was a big thing because they didn't have Holiday Inns yet. And we always read up on where we were going and looked at maps, and New Orleans was great.
So that would be a big adventure.
That
It's
was a
not
big
just
adventure.
like getting on 35 and driving north for 2 days.
No, it was an adventure. And then when I was about a sophomore in high school, we went east over Easter vacation. We went to Washington, D.C., then we drove up to New York, and then my dad had cousins outside of New York City in Liberty Manor, New York, and we visited them. And we went to the Black Hills one summer.
Did you ever see the mountains like Colorado?
No, we did
Never
not.
got west.
No, we did not.
All right. Now, what we're going to do when we get done going through these different series of events is we'll come back and have an all-star session where when you and Dad think of family stories that you forgot to tell, because I'm already thinking of things that I wish I would have asked Dad.
Okay.
We can come back, and it doesn't have to be in any particular order, telling about that. So that's what we should think about. But you've gotten me up into high school, and now tell me a little bit about your college years. About how you chose college and what leaving high school was like, and your college time.
I don't know. It was always expected that I would go to college. That was always a given. And I, being a good Lutheran, I think my parents I don't know if they exactly pushed, but we looked into St. Olaf, and I think everybody was happy with it. It was a smaller school than the University of Wisconsin. It was Lutheran.
Was it all girl at the time?
No.
Okay.
It was mixed, but it had a very good reputation. I'm not sure. Catherine went to the University of Wisconsin at La Crosse, and that was because she was interested originally in Phi Ed, but she went into elementary ed. But anyway, I guess we looked at St. Olaf, and I was happy. I wanted to go away to college, but it was like then, before the interstates, it was like 7 hours driving. So, I mean, it was a trek.
That's Minnesota, right?
Yes, in Minnesota, in Northfield, which was about 35 miles south of Minneapolis, St. Paul. Northfield probably had 10,000, 15,000 people. It had St. Olaf and Carleton College. They were both in Northfield. I think it was a blessing that I went to St. Olaf because it was smaller. You weren't as apt to get lost. You knew the professors, probably a situation like Trinity. And I really felt my horizons expanded exponentially there. And I felt I was really engaged in education and loved, everything I took, which was kind of started out as a general liberal arts education, but English and history and political science. And we took religion classes.
And you were there for 2 years?
And I was there for 2 years. But your dad and I were dating.
When did you start dating?
We dated in high school.
Okay.
We started dating, I believe, when we were juniors. And dated junior and senior year in high school. But I don't know, I didn't feel so tied down that I wanted to go to the university.
Right.
I think we felt we needed to spread our wings a little bit, and I went out to St. Olaf, although we were communicating and we still were dating. So as we got more involved, I did want to transfer to the University of Wisconsin.
And how did Grandma and Grandpa take that?
They were always very good. I think they would have preferred that I stay at St. Olaf, but they never said a thing.
Okay.
So they were very good about it. I think I probably just made up my mind, and maybe they didn't have much choice.
Okay.
But I never considered dropping out.
And did you have a major when you left, or were you still just taking...
I was going to be an English major, but that was one thing they said, you have to have an education degree. And I did think about journalism or, other fields. And I also thought about library science. And I looked into library science, but at that time it was a 5th-year program. So you would get a degree and then go to library school. And they had a good library school at the University of Wisconsin, but another year of college was too expensive. I knew your dad was going into the Army, so I didn't do it at that time.
So you transferred to UW.
Got a major in English and history.
And you were
education.
a junior. Was Dad a junior too?
Yes.
Okay.
We're 2 months apart.
Okay, so you get to Madison. Are you? Do you have an apartment? Are you staying on the dorm?
Yeah, a friend and I from St. Olaf both transferred. She was from Black River Falls. She decided to major in elementary education, and they didn't have that at St. Olaf. So we roomed together the first year at Chadbourne Hall, and then the next semester I got an apartment with a friend, and then between semesters we got married.
Okay, and so that would have been, if you were married in January, that would have been 1962?
It was 62, yep.
Okay.
And we had this apartment on Bowen Court, which is all redeveloped now. They were, just small, kind of, craftsman style houses. And we had, there were two apartments on the second floor. We had a living room with a hide-a-bed, a small living room with a hide-a-bed, and kind of a closet, and a small kitchen with a kitchen table for two and the shared bath. It was tiny, but we were very happy and we're glad to have it. And it was walking distance to campus, which was a good thing because your dad had bought a car. Did he tell you about the 1950?
We haven't gotten about the car, but you can tell me about it now.
Well, on our honeymoon, we had about 6 flat tires because he had gotten the car from a friend, and I can't remember the story, but the tires were obviously not good. So in January, we spent much of our honeymoon changing the tires and getting them fixed or whatever. And it didn't start. That was the other thing about the Ford. It didn't start in cold weather.
Oh, well, Wisconsin. It's
Yeah.
not, and your major in college was it English?
English
It
and
was in
history.
English. Okay. Well, we're going to conclude this for now, and then what we're going to do next is, not today, but the next time, we'll get you and Dad, and we'll have both of you together, and we'll talk about, the early dating years,
Yes.
marriage.
And we
often-
can go back. We had a lot of fun at the University of Wisconsin.
Yeah, I don't want to hear
and
about
that was
that.
one thing, I guess one reason I wanted to transfer, because they weren't having as many parties and there wasn't as much beer. I mean, you weren't
I don't
supposed
wanna
to
hear-
drink beer. And there were a few limitations.
And Madison in 1961 and 62 would have been a pretty happening place.
Yes. Oh, there were football games and, there just was a lot. Hockey games and basketball games. And there was a lot going on.
Well, good. This was good. Good phase one. And thank you. And we will pick this up later.